When I was 7 years old, my mother and I moved to a small town in Massachusetts. It was a rough time for me as my father had just up and left a few weeks before. My mom told me that he had taken a better job somewhere. She told me that he still loved me and cared about me, but even at such a young age, I understood that he had left us. It was Halloween week, and I started at my new school on the 25th of October. As a stubborn 7-year-old, I insisted on walking there by myself. My mother frowned, thought it over, then agreed, with one caveat. Okay, as long as we walk the path together every evening before school starts, and you promise to stay on the trail. She had purchased a small 2-bedroom cottage less than a mile from my school, so it wouldn't be far. It was a nice little place, but I guess with my father gone, nothing could really feel like home. The evening before school began, the two of us walked into the forest behind our home. Although the sun was starting to set, the path was clearly lit. What a perfect way to school. Can you believe this house was still available? She said. I nodded and said nothing. We used to have family here, you know. I really like this place. The next morning, I made my way into the kitchen and was greeted with a warm smile and pancakes. As I sat down to eat, my mother must have noticed that I looked nervous and sat down next to me. Don't worry, you'll make friends here. I have a good feeling. Looking back, I can't really understand how after her husband leaving, she could be so strong. I just hope I'm strong too. I made my way down the path just as we had practiced. When I arrived at school, a tall teacher with thick glasses greeted me at the door and helped me into my classroom. I sat down among 10 other students and the teacher began to speak about what the year was going to be like. No one was mean to me or anything, but no one really spoke to me either. All the kids were so busy talking about their costumes for Halloween that they barely even noticed I was there. There was this one little girl though that said hello. She sat 2 rows back from the other kids and I figured that maybe she was new here as well. She was very pretty with brown hair and glasses. And as I glanced back, she caught my gaze and gave me a big smile. I tried to smile back, but she was so pretty it was hard not to be shy. I turned back around and tried to listen to the teacher, but I was really just thinking about her. School ended for the day at 3 o'clock. I grabbed my bag and rushed outside towards the path to my home. I was so anxious to run home and tell my mom about the pretty girl that had smiled at me. Hurrying down the path, I suddenly tripped over something and fell hard, scraping my knee. Sitting up to examine my injury, I looked back to see what had made me stumble. It was the biggest crow I'd ever seen. Strange, too. What was wrong with its eyes? As I made my way closer to examine it, I heard, "Hello, I know you from school." Surprised, I looked up quickly to see the pretty girl. Wondering if she saw me fall and thinking how stupid I must have looked, I straightened up quickly. My knee hurt, but I was more worried about how I looked to her. Yeah, I think I saw you today in class. My name's Jimmy." Smiling back, she replied, "I'm Margaret." We walked together down the trail. "How's your leg?" "Oh, it's okay," I said, trying to sound strong. "You live down here too, huh?" She told me that her family had lived in this town for some time, and that she also had a path behind her home leading through the forest to the school. We were instantly friends. As we got to my house, she surprised me by asking, "Can I see what your house looks like? You made it sound so nice." I quickly smiled and showed her the way. I knocked on my front door and my mom answered, very surprised to see her next to me. Smiling, she said, "Well, you don't waste time making friends, do you, Jim? Are you going to introduce the young lady or just stand there?" My face turned red as I muttered out, "This is Margaret. She lives around here and we met at school today." Trying to not show my excitement, I tried to act cool. "She wanted to come over," I said. Margaret smiled and said, "Hello, ma'am. I wanted to see your house. My family lives here too." "Come on in, dear." I just this instant finished a batch of cookies. As the 3 of us sat around the kitchen table, we got on the subject of Halloween. "What are you going as, Margaret?" "I'm going to be a witch this year. I heard they're scary." "Witches aren't scary," I quickly replied. Smiling back, Margaret corrected herself. Well, I wanted to go as a witch, but my family is going out of town this weekend on a business trip, and the lady who watches me called this morning and said she has the flu. They're calling other sitters, but my mom interrupted her. Well, if it's okay with your parents, you would be welcome to stay here and go with us. It was at that moment I realized that I literally had the best mom in the world. What do you think, Jim? Yeah, that's a great idea. Margaret smiled back, saying nothing. My mom drove Margaret home to meet her parents and asked their permission for her to stay. When my mom got back, I asked her how it went. Great. I think her mom and her aunt take care of her. They live in a beautiful little cottage down the trail. They invited me in and we talked for quite some time. They thought it was a great idea. I do have one question though. You have a crush on this girl, right, Jim? Pretending I didn't hear her, I quickly walked over to my room and closed the door. Got homework. Love you. That night I tried to sleep but was too excited for Halloween. It was just a few days off and I had already made a friend. This weekend was going to be great. Thinking about how this was a pretty good start, I began to close my eyes, and that's when I noticed something in the corner of my room. At first I thought maybe I was dreaming, but then slowly my eyes began to focus. There was a tall, slender man with long hair and a thick gray beard. His eyes were cold, and he stared out the window. I tried to remain perfectly still as I hid under the blankets, praying he hadn't seen me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. After what seemed like hours, I slowly lowered the blanket from one eye and I nearly screamed out in terror. He was just floating there, holding a large axe with what looked like blood on it. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out, and what if it woke up my mother and I couldn't think anymore. I just hid under the covers and prayed he would go away. I must have fallen asleep somehow though, because when I woke the next day, he was gone and it was like it never happened. I wondered if it was a dream. I wanted to tell my mom, but I just couldn't. I don't know why. The week went by quickly, except for every single night, the man in my room would return. He held the large axe with both hands. Some nights he would just peer out the window, and other nights he would pace back and forth. I could see his mouth move, but no words came out. The night before Halloween, he finally turned his head and looked directly at me. Locking eyes with mine, he took a step forward. I pulled the blankets over my head. Why was this happening to me? Was I crazy? Halloween day came just the same though, and I almost told Margaret about the man in my house. I felt guilty for not telling her, but I was afraid she would think I was crazy or something, and looking forward to this weekend was the first thing I'd been happy about in as long as I can remember. Margaret and I went house to house that night. I tried to have a good time, but wondered what was going to happen tonight when she stayed at our home. Would the man come again? Would he see her? She asked me what was wrong, and I pretended it was nothing. As we got back into my house, my mom had prepared a sleeping space for us in the living room. Margaret was going to sleep on the couch, and I had a blanket spread out over the floor. We inventoried our candy and both agreed that we were tired. My mom was sleeping in the next room and told us to wake her if we need anything at all. That night, as Margaret and I went to sleep, a storm kicked up and the wind started to rattle against the windows. I told myself that I'd never seen the man outside my room, and maybe he was just in my imagination. I felt guilty, but it was just so nice having a friend with me. I couldn't take seeing that man, or whatever he was, by myself. The storm became louder and louder as the clock struck midnight. I stared at the ceiling and was about to fall asleep when I heard Margaret ask, "Jimmy, are you awake?" "I'm up." "I can't sleep. It's freezing. Do you have another blanket?" I told her I had one in my room. I froze, realizing what I had just done. I would have to go back into my room. Searching for any other option, I knocked on my mom's door for a blanket, but she didn't reply back. The storm was so loud now that even knocking didn't wake her. I thought about yelling my mom's name, but realized how childish that would make me look to Margaret. "Didn't you say you had a blanket in your room?" I took a deep breath and replied, "Yes, I'll go get it for you." Opening the door slowly, I saw no sign of any ghost. Holding my breath, I quickly ran over to the far closet to find the extra blanket. Fumbling through my clothes, I froze as I heard the door close behind me. The wind now howled against the house, and it took every ounce of my courage to turn around. There was no ghost. It was just Margaret. "It's just you," I said. Margaret smiled sweetly and replied, "Who are you expecting, the boogeyman?" I heard her locking my door behind her. As my eyes became used to the dim light, I noticed something was wrong. "Margaret?" As she turned back to me, I noticed she was taller than before, much taller. I saw a large knife in her hand. The moon shone across her face. What was once a beautiful young girl was now an old woman with a hideous grin on her ancient face.
"Be careful who you invite in, Jimmy. Didn't your father ever tell you that?"
I stumbled back farther into the room and screamed out for my mother.
"She can't hear you, Jimmy. She's never going to hear you."
I knew that my only chance was to jump through my window, but as I tried to move forward, my arms and legs remained frozen. I was powerless. She motioned with her right hand, and I began to slide forward across the floor. As I watched myself move closer and closer, she lifted the knife up over her head and smiled wickedly. What happened next, I will remember for the rest of my life. Before she could bring down the knife, something caught her eye. She looked over towards the window, and gasping, she sunk back against the door. Screaming out in shock and rage, she clawed at the door handle in rabid desperation. But he stopped her. Holding onto her with one hand, the tall man brought down the axe on her neck. She screamed in agony and fear, and suddenly in gaping silence as she tried desperately to crawl away. He placed his foot on her back, pinning her to the floor, and brought the axe down hard with both hands, severing her neck. All I could do was watch as he carried her body and head out through the window, across the backyard and into the forest. Stunned, I looked out. I could barely see, but I stood there and watched until he disappeared into the forest. I tried waking my mother, but she couldn't seem to hear me as I shouted her name. After I checked that she was okay, I went back into my room and just stood at the window. I think I was in some kind of shock. After a while, though, I heard her door open. I ran over to her and hugged her close. "Morning. You guys have fun last night?" I loosened my grip and looked up at her. At a loss for words, I slowly just nodded my head. "Tell Margaret breakfast will be ready in 2 shakes. Is she still asleep on the couch?" I mumbled something about her mom already having picked her up. Then my mom went into the kitchen to start breakfast. I wondered what I would say if her parents did show up to collect her. In the unlikely event that her parents were human, they would probably be thankful she was gone. That year was the start of a new chapter in my life. I now knew that demons, witches, ghosts, evil things weren't just fairy tales. They were real. I'm older now and I have a family of my own. My son was born a few months back, and I've never spoken a word of any of this to my wife. She doesn't need to know. One last thing. A few days after Halloween as a child, my mom had taken out a photo album and sat down next to me. I watched as she casually thumbed through the photos, and then I stopped her. "Who is that man?" I asked. "Him? That's your great-grandfather." I stared at the photo. It was him. I slept better after that. I would still see him from time to time, staring out my window into the darkness. Margaret wasn't the last evil thing I would come across, and I now worried about the safety of my newborn son. It's Halloween night as I stand over my son's crib and stare out into the darkness of the forest beyond. I can feel something coming for us. But they don't know one thing. We're not alone.